I shall now hand over to my good colleague, Sue Denman in Together for Change, who will be today in conversation with Selwyn Williams. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much, Jessie, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's session. Today, we're going to be turning our attention to an economic model that is very different to the conventional one that is favoured by governments in the UK. The conventional ones measure success in terms of growth, GDP, and largely, I feel, extract wealth from our communities and actually concentrate the wealth in the hands of a few people. There are a number of new economic models around, and I'm sure you will have heard of many of them: donut, regenerative, well-being, and they're all actually seeking to address sustainability and social justice. But what is different about the approach that you're going to hear about today is that it's firmly embedded in communities and in community development. It's called communitisation. And it's been shown now through evaluations to have a real positive effect in our communities in North Wales and beyond North Wales. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Sel Williams to you. Sel has been championing a case for this approach for some years, and he's done some brilliant writing as well that is persuasive about it being a way forward for Wales. You might have read already Sel's bio. He's got a rich working background that includes teaching, research, and writing. He has 50 years of experience in community development, and he continues to teach on courses both in Welsh and in English. He's currently the director of a number of community enterprises and networks in North Wales, which he will, I'm sure, talk about later. And over the next half hour, I will draw out his thinking and his practical experience through some questions. After that, it would be great if you could engage with us in terms of maybe putting comments in the chat or putting your hand up, or also posing questions. Whatever you would like to say, we would really welcome as part of this session. So, Sel, thank you very much for giving your time to this programme. We're really excited that you're here with us. Can I just start off by saying that this session is about a radical community model that could really transform the economy and communities of Wales. It's been a long-standing passion of yours, we know that. And can you tell us a little bit about your background so we understand the basis of your interest and your commitment to what I will call a movement?
Right, okay. Very mixed background, from being a farm labourer to builder's labourer to being a research scientist to being a school teacher to being a college lecturer. And the last few years before I retired, I was working in the university in Bangor, and we did develop courses in community development, largely despite the system and despite the college. And I think that speaks volumes really for a lot of our experience with community development. I very much like the motto of one of the Irish community development organisations. They have the motto, "It is better to seek forgiveness than permission." And I think a lot of the time we have to sort of operate in that sort of way. Having said that, I was talking to my wife about it earlier, and she was saying, you still don't know what you want to do when you grow up. Maybe this sort of varied background has been a help in a way, because I've been able to sort of come to community development from a sort of a varied sort of academic background as well as a practical one. Yeah, does that give you some sort of idea of where we've got to? And in a way, before retiring, I retired from the college more than 12 years ago now. And really, since retiring, it's given me an opportunity to be more involved with community enterprises and community development in my own area, which is the Fishkinog area in northwest Wales, an old slate quarrying area.
Any influences earlier on, Sel, in your life? You brought up in the Conway Valley, weren't you? And any family influences on your thinking? And
yes, yeah, my grandfather was quite a character, and he was very much got himself into all sorts of trouble with the establishment, and I suppose in those days we were all sent to Sunday school, and in a way, although I'm not conventionally religious anymore, I think at least that Sunday school experience gave you an opportunity to think along philosophical terms. And I owe a lot to looking back to those Sunday school teachers who they weren't sort of pushing religion down your throat. They were really trying to get you to think about moral issues and about politics, really, which was something you didn't get in the education system. And then I suppose the community I was in, there was a strong community, and the areas that I've lived in subsequently, they've been areas where there has been a sense of community, which I've really sort of appreciated and I found really valuable. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Obviously, a very rich experience, practical and academic, will have shaped your thinking. And of course, the values that you have through your community in your childhood and early adulthood. It's really, really interesting. And I like the saying, better to seek forgiveness rather than permission, because I feel, looking at the developments in North Wales, that's been very much the, if you like, the saying that's been adopted, and such progress has been made. I want to move on to some of the big thinkers that may have influenced you as well. Many of the great things that happen in society originate from big thinkers, people who inspire and challenge, sometimes years after they've actually passed away. And I'm wondering whether there's anybody in particular who's influenced you, and in what way is that encapsulated in the sort of things that you're doing in community development?
Yeah, that's quite difficult, that. I was very much a student of the 1960s, and I suppose Marxist politics did influence me very much in that sort of period. And by now I've sort of been able to put sort of Marxism more into a sort of category which I can sort of handle. I think what the Marxist tradition gives you is an analysis of capitalism, but not much more than that. I think Marx himself said that he couldn't provide a cookbook for us. All that Marx does in a way is analyse capitalism, as do others in that tradition. But I think it's still maybe a good starting point, but it's only a starting point. Then I think a lot of the people that have been involved with politics in all sorts of ways, sort of people also within the Welsh tradition. I have a huge respect for the poet Waldo Williams, who was a Pembrokeshire poet, who was a socialist, but also a pacifist, and I suppose a Christian. But I think what was really remarkable about him was that he actually didn't separate life from his poetry. His poetry really was part of his living, and his living was part of his poetry, which makes him quite a remarkable poet. But the influences are so varied, and it includes, people within our own communities, people who have lived lives and have have lived lives and have given out love to people. And
Yeah.
I could add, this is quite an odd one. I could add an Irishman in a bar in Dublin. I'd been as part of a group of people from North Wales who had been invited to speak at a Dale in Dublin concerning nuclear power. And because I have a scientific background, I talked a little bit about nuclear power. And having done my best with this address to the Dale, I just went for a pint of Guinness in a bar this afternoon, and I just wanted some peace and quiet. But there was one Irishman there, and he was insistent, asking what we were doing. I was explaining, well, we were worried about nuclear power, explaining about plutonium, that plutonium doesn't exist in nature and what have you, and it went along these lines. And eventually the Irishman kept on pestering me, and he sort of said, well, what's more powerful than plutonium? And I was sort of explaining a thimble full of plutonium is enough to give everybody in Europe cancer, and it doesn't exist in nature. But he kept on insisting that what's more powerful than plutonium? And I said, well, thinking along those lines, I couldn't think of anything. And his answer was human love. And in a way, you think about it, there's so much in that answer. It's really what we have in the end against the ultimate violence is our ability to actually go beyond that sort of way of thinking and to think really the important things about communities, about the relationship between people. And the one thing that we can do to actually defeat violence is human love. So our influences are so varied like that on this room.
Yeah. Definitely love for the planet, love for people, going from poetry to a Guinness in a bar. That's a really lovely story. I've noticed in your writings that you also give credence to the thinking of Raymond Williams. Can you say a few words about some of his work and influence on you?
Yes, very much so. Raymond Williams was, in a sense, in the Marxist position, but he was really quite different to a lot of traditional Marxists in that he thought so broadly. And really, his contributions have been immense. He really changed the whole thinking in the English-speaking world about the whole idea of culture. Of culture not being something elitist, but something really which is about all our lives. It's odd in a way, because Raymond Williams didn't have the Welsh language, but in a way, the way he sort of redefined culture in a way brought it very similar to the way in which we talk about diwylliant culture in Welsh as something which is belongs to the people and is ordinary rather than something which is elite. But Raymond Williams was also, he wrote so well about community, and particularly about community in Wales. I think I can use one of his quotes that I rather like, which is really relevant to what we are talking about today. This is Raymond Williams in 1984 on the theme decentralism and the politics of place. And he says, ideally, a new movement comes out of new ideas being specified in particular places. Then there may be a model being expressed which is adaptable to the interests of other places and scales of operation. These can be ideas relating to long or short-term real interests and the policies which express them. It is perfectly clear that ideas have to federate within the nature of the analysis, and he goes on in that vein. And if I can use one other quote too, he says, radical and communal Wales will be real to the extent that it develops in plan and practice new forms of cooperative work and communal socialism, new kinds of educational and cultural collectives, rather than what happens to the Labour or the nationalist vote. That is, he's sort of saying what we do within our communities is a form of democracy, a form of politics, which is fundamentally so vital, so important. And this whole idea of a new movement, which comes out of so much of Raymond Williams's work. Yeah.
It's really exciting, and that really resonates, doesn't it, with communitisation? Did he coin the phrase communitisation, or is that something that
No,
evolved after?
No, in a way, communitisation has come from another direction, from a Welsh language direction in a way, and it's quite significant. It's a bit complicated, but if you look at Raymond Williams's key words, and he traces the word community in English, and basically what happened with the word community was, up to say the 17th century, people would talk about the local society. Society would be the word for what we would describe in English as the local community. But with the growth of the state, then the state needed a word for the people within the state. So the word society moved from local to national. This is in English. Yeah. So then you needed a word for the local society, and hence the word community. Okay.
Yeah.
That happened in the 17th century in English. It didn't happen in Welsh until the second half of the 20th century. The word cymuned, which is equivalent to community, didn't exist in Welsh until the 1960s. So the word cymuned itself, because for my mother's generation, they would still use Dyhead, which is the equivalent of society. And as Wales didn't have its own state, then what happened in a way was that the word for community only develops when you have an emerging or a developing Welsh state. We have a sort of a state with some sort of power now. So the same thing happened in Welsh, but almost 3 centuries later. But that might be sort of interesting in terms of following the meaning of words. But the significance of it is far greater. What it means is that if you think of Wales, you think of it not as a nation state, but you think of it as how could it exist or persist for so long as a nation without its own state? Well, it existed and persisted and still does largely as a community of communities, which makes the idea of a nation very, very different to the idea of a nation state as you would have in the case of Britain, Germany, France, Spain, and so on and so forth. Those increasingly were defined in terms of the state, whereas the ideas of the nation in Wales and maybe in Catalonia and the Basque Country, what have you, they are more defined in terms of the people, in terms of a community. So those are, I think, important factors for us in community development now. Yeah.
And that's a strong argument for that place-based community, focus for the future, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sal, I want to turn to some evaluated examples of this approach or model working, communitisation. And I think we're all hoping that you will draw on some examples that are local to you and also beyond, if you have any. So could you tell us a little bit about how this actually works in practice and what are the benefits of it?
Okay. It's worked this way. It's come from practice, really, Sue. And if I just go back, as I said, I live in the Festiniog area. We did have communities first in the Festiniog area, which was a real help because it meant that a few people could be employed and they could be paid to do community development work. But that only lasted 5 years in our area, but we were able to continue afterwards. And somehow or other, we were able to network organisations within the area. And we were fortunate there were a couple of community enterprises that have been going for several years, like Seven, which has been going for 20, 30 years. But also in my own village of Llanfestiniog, the local hotel was about to close. Cut a long story short, we as a community got together, bought the local hotel, and we've been running it successfully for 12 years or more now. And by now, it's really significant. The idea of communities taking over their local pub has become now a standard way of thinking in Wales. It's really indicative that the public are generally thinking in different ways, but certainly about the idea of taking over pubs. If we could extend that sort of public understanding and public consciousness to other aspects of the economy, following on from what's happened with community pubs. That would be an immense way forward. But just coming back to what happened in our own area, by now I think there's 16, 17 social enterprises in the Festiniog area. That's an area with a population of, what is it, 10,000 people altogether. And just the very simple thing of actually networking, of bringing these social enterprises to work together, has such obvious, huge advantages. But it wasn't easily done because the individual social enterprises were so busy that there was as much as they could do to look after their own sort of interests. But once we got people to think a little bit outside their own immediate sort of communal interests, their own enterprise interests towards a more communal interest. For example, we have 2 hotels, we have several restaurants, cafes, but quite a bit of sort of community tourism. Well, to market all those, it doesn't make sense for individual hotels to market it. We market the whole area, and so on and so forth. Obvious sort of examples of working together like that. And the other thing that's really important is you can call it some sort of a model, because the social enterprises that we have, or the community enterprises we have within the Festiniog area, by now they employ over 150 people, plus all the sort of volunteering, plus all the sort of positive advantages to the community, other than the economic ones, that is the social and cultural ones. But also we then sort of started to see there was similar sort of things happening in 2 other slate valleys, in the Ogwen Valley around Bethesda and in the Nantlle Valley around Penygroes. So we started to network, to cooperate with those 2 valleys. So the 3 slate valleys got together. And again, once you have this sort of cooperation, there are huge advantages. Not only advantages with practical things, but also just sharing skills and also sharing confidence. And it gives people a sort of an idea that all this creates different possibilities. It's a change of consciousness. And then fairly recently, over the last 2 years, what we've done now is to try and bring the social enterprises and the community enterprises across the county of Gwynedd together. And it depends how you count them, but there's about 40 now social enterprises networked on a Gwynedd level. And if you look at the resources that those networked social enterprises had, we just collected data on 23 of the social enterprises which are part of the County of Gwynedd network. And the assets are worth over 43 million. The turnover annually is 13.5 million. The people employed, 239 employed full-time, 215 employed part-time, over 500 volunteers. You're talking of something quite significant. And forming this sort of critical mass obviously helps economically, but also helps in terms of confidence. It also means that people can now begin to seriously look at this as a different way forward, because we've created really a model which is about the communitisation, that is the community taking over our resources. And if you put that in a context, and here it becomes unapologetically political. If we look at the whole history of Wales, it makes me cross, really cross at times, because I see so much in our own area poverty. If I think of maybe a third of our children in Wales living in some sort of poverty, when you think of the history of this place, the slate in this area, the coal, the iron, the steel, the tin plate, the agricultural products, the tourism, and so on and so forth, we should be one of the richest countries in Europe, but yet we end up as one of the poorest countries in Europe, and that makes me absolutely cross. And the reason is that that wealth has been extracted the whole time. I look at Blaenau Ffestiniog with, in 1900, the second largest town in North Wales, only Wrexham bigger. Now the population is half what it was 100 years ago. And still we have, despite losing that economic base, we still have an inheritance of culture, which is quite a bit to do with the whole idea of community. And that's something we can build upon. So to think a bit more positively, despite the fact that economically the system has been against us, despite all that, if you think of our history in Wales, I hadn't realised until fairly recently, 1845, Wales probably had the highest percentage of people that could read and write of anywhere in Europe. And that would have been done despite a hostile state. This is people reading and writing in Welsh. And it was all done through community effort. Quite remarkable. But if you think of all the religious establishments that have been built, of all the workmen's associations, all the sports facilities, all the workers' institutes, the beginnings of a health system, all these things, what we have is a strong tradition of community, an inheritance of community, and that is something we can build something different upon. And to me, the whole idea of communitisation is about building on that tradition of community in Wales, but also coming to an analysis of why Wales ends up as such a economically relatively poor. And it is because, quite simply, the way the system works, and it's quite interesting. Today, a book is being published called Vulture Capitalism by somebody I really admire, Grace
Blakely.
Her book that she published on a few years ago called Stolen. It makes an analysis of the stage of which capitalism is in Europe at the moment, particularly in the UK. And basically what she's pointing out is that from the end of the 1970s on, capitalism has changed in the UK to be so much about the city in London. It's finance which dominates everything. Obviously, finance is the Tory party. The prime ministers have all come from that sort of background. And in a way, the financialisation of the economy means that the City of London has got its tentacles into everything. What we think of all people's homes and what have you. But in a way, we're paying a lot for the care of all people. But a lot of that is to actually repay money which is being borrowed from the city. We think of housing associations. More and more the tenants are indirectly feeding the City of London. Obviously, the City of London is anxious to get its tentacles more and more into our national health system and so forth, and so on and so forth. But communitisation actually does the opposite. Every time we communitise something, every time we take it into our community ownership, then we are depriving the city from a way of extracting wealth from our communities. We've done quite a bit of research recently on the difference between community tourism and corporate tourism. Tourism is now the biggest industry in the world. It overtook agriculture about 20 years ago on the world level. In Wales, it's obviously important. 17 million a day on average is the income generated from tourism. But our researchers haven't been asking the question, which they do ask in Ireland, where does that 17 million go? Who gets that income? And the research we're doing is showing so clearly it's just out 40 is large corporations. I was looking at caravan parks in Bentrec or Anglesey, 24 caravan parks, 22 of them are owned by multinationals. You think that the local farmer might be doing something. No. So hugely extracted is the tourist industry again. But we've done a little bit on community tourism and developing it in the Ffestiniog area. We've got Ystbrydoliaeth, which is a mountain bike facility. And when you analyse the income that generates, so much of it goes on wages, on goods which are bought locally, and that income stays locally, multiplies locally, and doesn't leak out. But if you compare that to so much of the sort of tourism which is extractive, then that is again taking our resources, our labour, and extracting and taking it out. And it makes me really cross. There's one example in the Conwy Valley, for example, where a large company set up what was called Ysbrydoliaeth. Totally odd idea to have a surfing facility inland 20 miles, 25 miles away from the nearest coast. This was set up on the old aluminium works in what used to be aluminium works in Dolgarrog in the Conwy Valley. To cut a long story short, last year it made a loss of 1.85 billion and it's now closed. I was trying to explain to a boy in the village, a 10-year-old, about this Ysbrydoliaeth, and explaining to them that they were using vast amounts of electricity to create waves for people to surf inland. And the 10-year-old said, well, wouldn't it make more sense to use waves to make electricity rather than the other way around? So environmentally, this place never made sense. Economically, it didn't make sense. Socially, the way it had everything employed on $3 contracts, and also it was very hostile to the Welsh language. It wasn't willing to put signs up in Welsh. But that Ysbrydoliaeth, which has now gone bankrupt, it received nearly £8 million of government, Welsh government money, aid. And the case we're making is, if we do that research comparing community tourism and corporate tourism, and then we can put a case to Welsh government and say, well, the support which you unquestioningly are giving, I don't know what the figures are now, but I did an analysis maybe 10 years ago. 80% of economic development money in Wales goes to multinationals. It's massive, absolutely massive. Their lobby is so powerful. The lobby government is so powerful. But if we could change that, and it doesn't have to be a revolution overnight, but a change in balance of moving away from that sort of idea about economic development and moving more and more towards the sort of economic development which communitisation is about, of actually our communities owning, controlling, and keeping our wealth. Sorry, that simplifies the whole thing, but that's the essence of it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Really powerful argument there for moving the economic model in Cardiff, away from these big grants that often, well, we know from over the last 20 years, since I've been involved in this field, that they don't bear fruit, do they? But sticking with the question of politics and persuading Welsh government, how do you think that we could work together in order to persuade our politicians that they need to rethink at least the balance, of where the support goes? Do you have any idea? Because if we're talking about a movement, and a radical movement, then we've got to work collectively. I know North Wales has had a big influence on thinking, but I'm thinking that if we join forces nationally in Wales, what power that could have.
It could be absolutely immense. Yeah. I was fortunate. Whilst I was still working in the university in Bangor, we did take students to Sweden at one time, and I learned quite a bit about what had happened in Sweden. The northern areas of Sweden, I think the rural areas, where only 10, maybe 15% of the population live, they sort of realised, well, government isn't going to listen very much to us because we're a minority. But to cut again a long story short, what's happened in Sweden is that communities have organised themselves into community associations. So there are over 1,000 now community associations, and they come together and they hold a parliament of the communities every 2 years. And this is a really powerful force. The state government in Sweden begs to be allowed to be present in the parliament of the communities. And the parliament of the communities more or less tells the state parliament what they want and how to do it. So I think we need to do, I think, 3 things in Wales. So one, the idea of communitisation, doing it within our own communities, influencing the public. You know, I mentioned earlier that the public have come over to the idea of community pubs by now as a way forward. Well, extend that to other aspects of the economy and society. So generating a different consciousness within the public generally. Secondly, communities or community organisations working together, exactly as you say. We've done that within the slate boring areas. We've done it on a county level now. We need to do it on a Wales level, of actually coming together, of communities, of community enterprises helping one another. And then the third element is how we influence policy. And there are doors which are ajar in the Welsh Government in Cardiff. There are doors which are ajar with, I think some of the politicians would appreciate if we push those doors a bit more open. They need that support from outside, or from the community. And obviously, you know, people are realizing the situation is not sustainable environmentally, economically, socially, culturally. What we have at the moment doesn't make sense. We have to find an alternative. And okay, this may be communitisation of the whole idea around communitisation is one element, but maybe it can be an important element in contributing towards the sort of changes that we have to pursue. Yeah. Sorry, I think I'm on my notes a bit now. Yeah.
Those three pillars are great to bear in mind. The notion of, you know, practicing this within our own communities, convincing the public, working together at all Wales level to convince our politicians. I think that's a great summary of a way forward. And of course, we do have some national forums where these issues can be raised and we can join forces. I'm thinking Resourceful Communities Partnership. I'm thinking of the Community Movement Cymru.
Yes,
those of you who are here, do look at those two organisations because they have different roles but could be influential in different ways. I was going to ask you, Sel, whether you have hope for the future, but I know you're going to say yes, and your whole presentation has been hopeful and full of ideas and full of hope. So I'm going to, as we've got about 10 minutes left, open up the discussion to those of you who are here. Kate Griffiths has asked if, Sel, you could make available the research you were quoting. And Kate, Jesse will put the link to the paper, communitisation paper, in the chat function. But I'm sure that there'll be more research and evaluation behind all this. So, Sel, if you could let us have those, we could share more widely with the people who've joined this session. So can I, if Kelly can put everybody's picture, I can see Andy's hand up. So I'm going to start with Andy. Andy, have you got a question for Sel?
I'm Andy
or a comment?
Andy Green from Grow Social Capital. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just worried that unless we change the fundamental mindset of politicians and policymakers, a danger of sort of seeing this as maybe another quick fix, a silver bullet. We talk of like community realization, where both sides have got to grow from the encounter. And I'm just worried that the traditional mindset is a transactional one, where they're to take from you, oh, you've now got another new trick and a new silver bullet that they can maybe give it a go. But unless they grow as well as part of the process, I'm just really worried that it's going to be seen as a quick fix, and as a result, it won't fulfill its potential.
No, I share that very much, Andy. Yes, and I understand your concern. I suppose a little bit of an answer of it is all this has come a little bit from a theory, but not much. Most of this has come from the practice that we've actually experienced, and certainly this doesn't quite relate head on to what you were saying, but it is sort of tangentially relevant. Gwynedd Council, maybe 10 years ago, would look at us, what we're doing in the Festiniog area. Well, they're those sort of cowboys up in the hills. Do you know that they're doing something? But by now, that tune has changed, and changed significantly. So I think it is possible to actually change things a little bit more than superficially, or that it is possible to have something which is more fundamental and really is some sort of an answer to your concerns, Andy, if I can put it that way. Yeah. Can I also, because people mentioned the research, we've been fortunate that for the first time, UKRI, which is the body which is responsible for investing in research, it usually invests in universities and research organisations. But for the first time, there's been a bit of money for communities to do some research, and we're doing exactly that on community tourism in Gwynedd. And there will be some, I think, interesting results from that research.
Yeah. Can I, whilst we're talking about research, mention the grant from a UKRI that Aberystwyth University has just secured, looking very much at the links between communities and policy and data to persuade policymakers, to have policies that speak to the needs of communities much more. I think it's a really exciting project, very early on in its gestation, but we're involved, and we certainly hope that will bring about some good results. Jessie?
Thank you. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Selwyn. Mae'n diddorol iawn. I'm interested in this idea of the tradition of community in Wales. It's such a strong ideology. It's something that I certainly know about. But I'm interested really in how, in the role of the public sector within this thought process around communitisation. So how does partnership with the public sector, how could it contribute to the ideology, or sort of support it, or support the movement? What's that role of the public sector within communitisation?
Yes, yeah. Sometimes there's quite a bit of friction between the community sector and the public sector. It happens with local government, but also there are times when they get together, even with community councils. In one area, the community council and the community sector are at cross purposes. You take a look at another area like the Ogwen Valley, where really the community councils have been absolutely instrumental in developing the community sector and work hand in hand. So there are so many examples where it is possible to have a working relationship which is really positive. Obviously, with the public sector, one of the huge questions which we've been touching upon is all this public money, where does it go? And does it actually go to feed capital, or does it go to feed community? Is it, after real questions about the way in which really capital has such a huge lobbying influence on government in Wales. The community sector is weak compared to the capital sector when it comes to influencing public, the whole public sector. So there's a huge potential to change that. And the more that we can produce the evidence that show the benefits of communitisation and other aspects of this sort of way forward. Sue, you were mentioning this very new, really huge research programme. It's really important that we influence that right from the beginning. And it is influencing these organisations. We've worked quite hard. It was quite good in the National Eisteddfod last year. We did have a stall called Communityoli, Communitisation. And it wasn't the stall that was so important, but we went round all these organisations trying to influence them. And you think it's sort of, hitting your head against the brick wall or something. But no, you find out later, no, that it has been an influence. At last, the business department within Bangor University is now looking seriously at the whole idea of communitisation. Whereas maybe less than a year ago, it would be somewhat dismissive of the whole idea. So it's hard for me because I'm so passionate about this now. So but I think I'm correct in seeing there are so many signs of this moving in a positive direction. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Sal. We got any other comments or questions? I've got an eye on the chat, but let me just see. There's some new messages there. Andy, this is another question, isn't it, from you? Is saying, is there a need to recognise and respect bottom-up led change and investment? Is that something you'd like to comment on, Sal? Slightly different.
This is bottom up, isn't it?
Yeah.
It has to come from the community sector, and it has to come from the communities working together.
Yeah. Well, if there's no other questions or comments, I'm going to draw our session to a close, and it just leaves me to thanking Sal very, very much for his presentation and his I think it's been inspirational, and I do feel that communitisation we should look at this more collectively, discuss it. Maybe it's the overarching concept with which we can communicate to policymakers and locally. It's certainly more meaningful than some of the more abstract concepts around the economy. Just to thank you very, very much, Sal, and let's pick up this discussion through our other forums and keep it alive, because I personally think that it certainly has legs. It's certainly worthy of much more collaborative working, behind it to make it happen. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And I'm just going to hand over to Jessie, who I'd also like to thank for organising this with Kelly. Big thank you again to Sel, who is a great champion of community development. And I'm sure through his support and his team's support, we can go forward and hope for some change in the not too distant future. So Jessie, over to you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sue. Diolch yn fawr iawn. I would just like to say on behalf of Together for Change, PAVS, and for the Resourceful Communities Partnership, thank you all for attending today and for showing your questions. I think it's been a really inspiring session. We will be emailing you with an evaluation form and would really welcome your feedback. Please do sign up for future events. The link in the chat for all future sessions will be there in a moment. Our next session is on the 27th of March. It's a little longer. It's in the afternoon. It's called Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast. And this is about organisational culture. What is it? Do shared values, norms and belief have a greater influence on the success of an organisation than its strategic plans or goals? It goes right to the heart, perhaps, of some of the challenges that were highlighted in my question to Sel earlier. It's a great lineup. It's a panel discussion, and we would really like to see you there. So thank you ever so much. Diolch yn fawr unwaith eto, and hope you have a very good day. Thank you for coming.